Well, what are the most important factors to consider when investing? Tonight, as we said, Jan Karel Botha shares his 5 lessons he's learned when advising clients. Welcome to you all. Jan Karel, good to have you back with us on the Wealth Quest desk. So let's just take a look at what it takes to be a great financial planner. Of course, as we said, winning the award last year as the top financial planner in Southern Africa. Well done to you. But tell us what it took to get you to that point.
Well, I think a financial planner, first and foremost, needs to be a good all-rounder. And by that I'm saying he needs to know what's happening holistically in the industry. But I think more importantly, he needs to understand clients. He needs to take a lot of time and effort to really understand the client, because fund managers and product providers, they design products and funds on a daily basis, and they roll out, and it becomes more easier to design them and to maintain them, and to, at the end of the day, get a client to fit the most appropriate investment for a client. It becomes very tricky exercise, and you need to really understand the client, and then ultimately needs to gel the two together.
Do you go through all those lists? You know, are you risk averse? What do you enjoy doing on the weekends? How do you spend your money? I mean, is that what you do with your clients?
Well, firstly, taking time getting to know the client oftentimes involves soft questions, which has got nothing to do with their finances, understanding the family dynamic and so forth. But ultimately, what we like to do is to do due diligence on proper fund managers that we believe their philosophy is aligned to certain pockets of clients that you've got, and to slot those clients into those various solutions and philosophies of fund managers.
Let's get into it and take a look at the 5 lessons that you've learned. And of course, we've got a slide on this. So Kobie, take it away.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you look at your screen right now, you'll see the 5 lessons that are kind of most important when you get into advising clients. I mean, JC spoke a little bit earlier on about, you know, kind of the fund management dynamic and the design of portfolios and the construction of portfolios relative to actually advising. Very few people actually combine those two, and that's why advisors are so important. There you can see his 5 lessons, and we're going to be going through each one of those 5 in detail this evening. Time is an ally, debt is a killer, focus with the end in mind, horses for courses, remember your objectives, and then understanding the family objective. I mean, Jan Karel, let's start with the first one there, time as an ally. Can you give us a practical example of this?
Well, I mean, we all hear every now and again people say you need to focus on the long term, and short-term volatility should not distract your long-term goals. And we hear it all the time, but I can tell you in practice, you know, if markets came down for 12 or 18 months, which is fairly short term considering the long term, but 18 months is not a short term, is it? A short period of time, is it? So people get anxious, and like what we've had in 2012, I really need to sort of because all my clients they firmly believe they are equity investors now, you know, after the run of 2012. So you need to put in perspective and look at the long term. But in any given time, if you look at the long term graph of how equities performed and companies grew over time, looking at it, if you segment any one portion, you're going to be either very optimistic or very depressed, you know, looking at any one given time. And yeah, at the end of the day, you need to take the client back, show them the long-term view that you've got, and that time will correct whatever the short-term imbalances are at any point in time.
Yeah, I mean, Roland, what are your views right now in light of, I suppose, what's taken place as a result of the financial crisis and what markets are doing right now?
Well, I think it's very hard to, it is the right approach is to focus on the long term, but I think it's very hard to convince clients to sit still for 5 years. And I think especially now with volatility and with the kind of change that we're seeing globally, it's even more difficult. There are obviously clients who also change. So you have a client who today might be in a financial situation that they are not in 5 years' time. So your original long-term view is totally irrelevant in 2-3 years. They could have a financial windfall or a financial setback, and you got to then go and rejig the whole thing. So time is an ally, but you have to adapt with changing situations as well, right?
Yeah, well, as a colleague of mine, I had a client that said to him, an elderly client, said to him, stop focusing on the long term, because I don't even buy green bananas anymore. So the things change and you need to adapt to that.
Yeah, I mean, give us another example of what you do when it comes, how basically you invested in the equities and you know that you've got that horizon from the start when you invested in them. 6-7 years down the line, the situation for the client has changed, but yet the equities haven't quite delivered or got to the point where you would want them to be in order to start and moving out of them.
Well, we would hope for, and that's why we choose certain partner fund managers. We would hope that the philosophy of that fund manager is of such to look at certain time intervals and try to yield certain returns in certain time intervals and do a strategic or tactical asset allocation within those periods to minimize the fact that you may be in 5 years' time that you might have been in a neutral position due to markets crashing and then just recovering to where they were. So, but at the end of the day, the holistic financial planning that you've done with a client should accommodate to a large extent that portion, because that capital we usually plan for 7 to 10 years and longer, and that not being a guarantee that you can have the same situation in 7 or 10 years, but you need to sort of try and eliminate the biggest risks and eliminate, or try to achieve the most probable scenarios.
I mean, let's come back to this this kind of long-term view thing. I mean, I sit sometimes with, and I sat with a client the other day, guy's 45 years old, and he says to me, I just can't quite invest for the long term. And I said, well, your long term, quite frankly, could potentially be 40 or 50 years. I mean, you're only going to be hitting retirement by the time you get to 65. That's 20 years from now. And to understand the implications of that decision, just have a look at this graph quickly. And this shows you the very long term on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. Now, it's quite small to read some of the legend over there, but the actual graph shows you the performance of the JSE All Shares since 1970. And let's just go to the most recent events. There you can see the global financial crisis playing itself out. You can see the Japan or the Japanese tsunami playing itself out, and then the Arab Spring. That's point number 21 that you see right at the top there. Despite events, markets go up long term. If you've got an investment horizon that's 20 years and longer, you may as well be in equities, and you may as well get the compounding effect of actually being in equities. More clients should remember that.
Does this apply to other asset classes? The rule about long-term investment as much as it does to equities?
Well, I mean, for me, I think firstly, price volatility when it gets to bonds and say for instance property seems to be less than what it is in equities. The problem that we've got at the moment is that we might start changing the rule book slightly because we're sitting with all-time low interest and inflation rates globally at the moment. And at some point when there's a kicker that happens on the other side, you might start seeing price volatility actually picking up for these. Whereas if you use the normal volatility numbers for the last 20 years, you might actually be sorely wrong. And that's why you tread evenly and carefully when it gets to kind of the fixed income space, and I would probably dare say the property space locally as well.
Roland, any views on that?
Look, I mean, equities have delivered 17% per annum for a long time with a lot of volatility around that. But on average, that's an excellent return if inflation or inflation plus something is a hurdle rate or a required return. And the only way to temper that volatility is to add some other less volatile, uncorrelated asset classes. So we just did a study that showed that if you've got 20% in equity, your average return would be 15%. If you've got 70% in equity, your average return is just less than 17%. So no matter what asset allocation you had in South Africa, you had inflation plus a significant outperformance regardless of your skill set. The thing is that going forward now, obviously, if we are in this stuck in this low inflation environment and low interest rate environment with rising inflation, those asset returns might not be sustainable. But that might be a 5-year effect, and that's where somebody like Jan Karel has to speak to his clients and literally hold their hand. So it sounds to me like you have to listen a lot and you have to hold hands a lot as an advisor.
Ultimately, one of the big fund managers did a research about 2 years ago and looking at their equity fund, which is one of the most prominent equity funds in the country, and said that the average holding period for the average investor within their equity fund was less than 3 years. 84 or 86% of the investors, the individual investors, held their equity fund for less than 3 years. So very few people actually realize those returns if there's not someone holding their hand.
Let's get on to the second point. The next is, well, time is an ally, debt is a killer. So what does it mean when you've got a heavily indebted client? What do you do then? I mean, how do you take them through that process of getting rid of the debt? What would be your priority focus areas?
Well, let me take one step back. I think there's two types of debts that you need to look at first. First of all, the normal run-of-the-mill household short-term debt, and then there's also the big debate about long-term debt for gearing purposes. Lending from the bank to go and make an investment.
Yeah.
Now, on that second one, there's great arguments for tax incentives by having debt and gearing and so on. But to be honest, I've found very few people that have accumulated a substantial amount of money in their lifetime over-relying on gearing of debt.
From a personal perspective?
From a personal perspective. So, and then looking at short-term debt, I always tell clients, you can't be an investor if you've got short-term debt. It becomes a little bit of grey area when you're looking at debt for your house, your bond. But I mean, short-term debt vehicles, credit cards, and so on, don't even go close to investing in whatever other investment vehicles if you've got short-term debt. So we try and organize that debt for them, pay off the most expensive debt first, get them down to paying the least expensive debt last, and then ultimately start to migrate some of that cash flow into a proper investment structure.
Don't forget that when you've got debt, the more time you spend paying off the debt, the less time you have growing your assets.
Exactly.
And you only have one lifetime. So every day you spend paying off debt and trying to get into a growth environment is worth it. So
focus as much energy and resources as possible as getting rid of that debt, so you can move as quickly as possible into the equity growth space.
Exactly, and just one other point on that, and on this whole debt thing, people think because their salary is a sort of a insurance that they've got some certain cash flow, they may afford these repayments of the bonds and the vehicles.
But they're missing the opportunity cost because they're not investing, which they could do if they didn't have the debt.
Exactly, they're missing opportunity cost. And secondly, if something goes wrong and that income stream gets a knock, the whole thing tumbles down.
Well, I mean, that's what you get. You get a materialistic society on the one side of the equation, with lots of stuff to buy on the other side. And what do you get? Well, you get big household debt to disposable income. Look at the charts on your screen now. This is from Stats SA, and it shows you the South African picture as far as household debt to disposable income is concerned. And that, quite frankly, runs close to 80% at the moment. I mean, that's a big number as far as South Africa is concerned. And quite frankly, globally, this is still a fairly large number. As a matter of fact, the South African Savings Institute is an organization which continuously is saying to South Africans, listen, stop incurring the debt and start saving, because quite frankly, that is really speaking the safety net that you could build.
But there is a problem with saving. I mean, investing and saving are different things. Saving can be a tax inefficient thing, because most people say, if I leave my money in cash, I'm going to have to pay interest I'm going to pay tax on the interest. Whereas if you invest that and you lock it away for longer, then there's obviously a bit of a benefit.
What I often find, and maybe you can help me out over here, but I often find that the starting point for investments is often savings. Because people don't just naturally get involved in the equity market. People first say
they have to get used to putting money aside as opposed to going to restaurants and buying new cars. And
absolutely. And once you get to that point, then you slowly, incrementally start actually doing business in the equity market.
Yeah.
You know?
Jan Karel, what are you going to say about
No. Exactly just that. And just on the point of the tax inefficiency, Roland, just my point just now, that yes, it might be a little bit tax inefficient, but I'll rather work with that person that has got some cash flow freed up in his budget and a little bit of savings, even though it might have been even in his savings account we've accumulated zero interest. But the fact that he didn't have debt now it takes him one step closer becoming a proper investor.
Yeah, I was referring to people who keep their money in cash for too long a period. Sure. So if you keep it under your mattress or in the bank, well, keeping it in the bank in Cyprus didn't help you either. So saving money creates an opportunity cost that you could be investing.
You didn't make that mistake, though.
Luckily, I'm not in Cyprus. No.
Horses for Courses is the fourth one. But before we get to that interesting name there, talk to us about focusing with the end in mind. Because surely getting to the end is just making as much money as possible, or is it a little bit more specific than that?
Well, I think it slots in a little bit with the first point that time is your ally. And that is just what I just find is investors are motivated when they focus on the goal. ultimately. And then the short-term noise sort of becomes less of an issue. If your long-term goal or medium-term goal is to repay your bond or to accumulate enough savings for a proper retirement or whatever the case might be, or for that long plan for a holiday, whatever the case might be, if that's your focus, the other stuff becomes less of an issue. And we're constantly trying to take clients back one step and say, well, what is it that we plan for? How long is it we plan for? And then, and by doing that, you sort of eliminate the short-term issues.
Give us some of the objectives that you typically have with clients, because we always talk about, what are we planning for?
Yeah.
I mean, give us some of the typical ones.
Well, one of the typical ones is saving enough for retirement. I like to start off with planning for the longest one first, and then take it backwards to the here and now. And that the short and medium term ones might be repaying the bond, saving for tuition fees for the children, and so on. And the longer term goals, that would be saving enough for retirement. And then you would have some goals in between there. But ultimately, debt free on the one hand, and long term sustainable investment portfolio. Because what is it that we want to do? We want to have a sustainable investment portfolio that can replace your day-to-day income. It's ultimately what we work for.
You see, I mean, and unfortunately in the market you get kind of two types of people. You get the one type of person who says, look, I need the financial planning, I need to be able to set objectives, and then I need to kind of over time sit and kind of interact with these objectives, and I need to understand how much I need to put away for each one of these objectives, and I need to just let long-term compounding happen. That's a fantastic way of doing it, because you've actually planned around it. The other way is sitting down and saying, well, quite frankly, I just want to make some money, I just want to make returns. And the market is full of those kind of folk who literally put money into trusts, and if things work out, fantastic, and if they don't, they clip from one trust into the next trust, and so forth and so forth. And that's probably more disastrous for capital than anything else.
Let's go to horses for courses, because I suppose that's where you come in. You continue to remind your clients, as we were saying, taking you a step back and saying, what are we trying to achieve?
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest mistakes is that clients, especially when markets are volatile and certain asset classes outperform other asset classes. If you look at, let's say, a holiday home, the purpose for that holiday home is to provide you with a certain type of lifestyle. And what we find is that when the residential property market then booms, like in 2005, 6 and 7, those people start to compare their provident and pension fund investments to their West Coast apartment that they've got, and where they got 40 or 50% return on capital, and then they start to compare different asset classes within their own portfolio, but it's got different purposes, and that's the most dangerous thing that you can possibly do. Or what they'll do, they'll say, well, let's take two similar investments. Let's take two unit trust investments. One is for the purpose of tuition fees, and the other one is for long-term capital growth for retirement. Now, all of a sudden, after last year's equity market boom, they will now look at the long-term one and say, well, this is the better investment of the two, and comparing apples with pears.
And the last one, we've got to take a quick break now, but if you could just run us through understanding the family objective and what that means.
I think that comes back to what we've said right from the outset, is that the family dynamic, the value system, the history of family, and the whole tradition, and understanding how the family operate is absolutely vital. If a financial planner misses that dynamic, you might as well leave the whole thing, because ultimately there will be infighting and the whole purpose would be gone.